My name is Godfrey Bloom. I was an officer in NATO years and years and years ago, and I'm a graduate of the Royal College of Defence Studies and Strategy, and so I am a trained strategist. I was a member of the European Parliament, for what that is worth, which I suggest is not a great deal. My dissertation was on the economic impact of war. Well, I went back quite a long way, and it was from a British perspective. And I went back to the War of the Spanish Succession, which was in the early 1700s, and I took all our wars, apart from small colonial wars. I looked at all those in some detail and realised that we had almost never fought a war which was worth fighting or got anything out of it. In fact, I look across at other countries and I see that war is a very futile thing. Although I'm not a pacifist. I'm not a pacifist, I was a soldier, and I would expect to fight to defend my country. But I do not expect, or would not expect, to be called upon to fight for somebody else's country. If you have a war, and countries seem to go to war at the drop of a hat, I would argue that your war needs to have a mission. You need to have a war aim. What is it you want to achieve? Because it's going to be very expensive and it's going to cost a lot of lives. Warfare is a very nasty, evil business. And occasionally you have to fight a war, but in the main you probably don't have to fight a war. So unless you know exactly why you're fighting and what you're fighting for and what your exit strategy is, don't go in, because it's very difficult to get out of a war once you've started it. Much better off not to get into it to start with. Every military, even at a junior level, you have a mission. So maybe at a junior level or smaller level, it's to capture Hill 60. That is your mission. How are you going to do it? Who's going to do it? How long is it going to take? So on and so forth. And that's what your orders group is based on. You have to have that mission. Otherwise, how do you know whether you won a war or not? And very often, all countries go to war without that mission statement. It's all right if you're being invaded. That's nice. That's black and white. If you're being invaded, it's to stop the invader. That's understandable. But when you have a nuanced situation where you're actually supporting militarily, and of course the classic case that we see at the moment is the Ukraine, what is the mission statement, the true mission statement, I would argue, is regime change in the Russian Federation, which is fostered and sponsored by the CIA, the Washington neocons, MI6 in London, and so on and so forth. And this is the problem. Now the war is being lost, which nobody seems to want to admit at the moment, but the war is being lost because there was no mission statement. And I remember when I was in Washington, I went to see some people at the Brookings Institute, and it was about the first Iraq War. It was a few years ago, of course, now. And I asked then some bright-eyed, clean-cut youngsters at the Brookings Institute what the exit strategy was. And the answer came loud and clear: "Hey, Godfrey, we don't know what the exit is. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it." And that, I think, is such an American thing. It's absolutely, which is why every war that the Americans have fought since 1945 has been a dog's breakfast, because nobody knew what they were supposed to be doing and what the end game was. If you're going to commit all that money and all those lives and all the rest of it, you really need to know what you're trying to achieve, as any CEO of any company would do. But it seems when it comes to politics, or geopolitical politics, that people seem to lose sight of what the actual end game is. Now, where we have a problem is with politicians, and very senior officers, very often, I'm afraid, have not had real experience of war. And they seem to think it's like a teenage, you see teenage playing these war games on computers. They think it's like that. What they don't do, and they don't understand, is they want to go to places like the hospital, the British hospital at East Grinstead, the burns unit and the amputations unit, and see the young men who are maimed for life. And meet the families of the fallen. That is war. It's a nasty, ugly business, and we need to keep out of it if we can. It's not a game. So it's all very well being safe and snug in London with MI6, or safe and snug with the neocons in Washington in a concrete bunker sending young men to war, but it was ever thus. It was ever thus. Old men in the safety of their club, sending young men to die in war. No good ever comes of it. So when I did my dissertation at the Royal College, nearly all wars I studied were futile. Not every war. So, for example, we got nothing out of the First World War, which we call the Great War, 1914-18. Nobody to this day can actually assess what we got out of it other than the destruction of our financial reserves and our empire. And it was the same with the Second World War. We found ourselves in the middle of with the Soviet Union on one side and the United States Empire on the other. We didn't come out of that, and yet our casualties were high. It cost us a lot of money, debt that we're still in. Now, I will say one thing: we fought a small war for the Falklands. That was a British protectorate. That was a crown colony. And it was invaded by a fascist junta from the Argentine. There was no way that we could do anything but go to war over that. You know, in the same way, if somebody breaks into your house and threatens your wife and your children and your dogs and all the rest of it, you have to take him out in the most ruthless way you can, because you have nowhere else to go. But you don't want to get into a huge fight over a hedge, you know, whether who's clipped it or who's not clipped it, with your neighbour. It's futile, it's not worth the effort. You could look at Vietnam, you could look at Libya, you could look at the Horn of Africa, you could look at Iraq. The list is endless. Permanent war. It's expensive. And of course, the United States and Britain, we're in debt. We do it all on debt. Fancy borrowing money to go to war without a mission statement. I would argue that certainly the United States, which is the greatest military power on the planet, or certainly was until possibly very recently, we might be reassessing, who spend $1 trillion a year on their defence budget. Then you have to tax, print money, quantitative easing. You have to do all sorts of things in order to sustain that. And of course, then you've got to pay the interest on the debt. And of course, it's 32, I think the last count was something like $32 trillion debt from the United States, which used to be a very rich country. The United States was rich, and now it's extremely poor. And they're still fighting wars which are debt-based. And of course, you see the degradation of the dollar. The mighty Yankee dollar is slipping down, and it slips down every month. And it's liable to do so for some time to come. Wars are expensive. And they cost a lot of blood and treasure, and most of it is simply unnecessary. Nobody is going to invade the United States. Please, everybody, take my word for it. Nobody's going to invade the United States, certainly not militarily. First of all, in war, and you can go back to medieval wars. In Britain, you can go back to medieval wars. You can go back to the Napoleonic Wars, if you want to. In order to fund a war, and this is why Nixon took the United States off the gold standard, was to fund the war in Vietnam. And of course, what's actually happened is that the spending power of the dollar, compared with that time in 1970, I think it was, I was quite a young man, in 1970, is now 6 cents to the dollar. So your spending power has been reduced from $1 then to 6 cents now. And here's an interesting thing. When after the Battle of Waterloo in 1816, we went back onto the gold standard, we went onto the British sovereign, the gold sovereign, which of course stopped inflation. Because gold is a hard asset. So a loaf of bread in Great Britain in 1819, a loaf of bread was the same price as it was in 1913. And of course, then we had a war, and the pound was degraded. We went off of the gold standard to fight the war, and of course, the pound's been on skid row ever since. No good comes of it, but unless you're an arms manufacturer, always money. It doesn't matter what your problem is at all, ever. Any country this is, not just the United States, any country, if you do an audit trail, you'll find somebody somewhere is getting a backhander. You have an ideological situation as far as Israel is concerned, I would argue, so an ideological one. And then, of course, you have Friends of Israel or the Israeli lobby or Mossad, so you've got contributions to the Senate and to Congress in particular, which is why Israel and the United States are joined at the hip. This is the problem. And of course, I would suggest it's not just a question of money. I suspect it's blackmail, which is why they haven't released the Epstein files, for example. We don't know who was doing what to whom and why and in what manner. So it's money and it's blackmail, and it probably could be going on since the beginning of time. But it's absolutely ludicrous that you should have a small country of 6 million people actually dominating United States foreign policy and taking us close to a world war. We could be nuclear. It could be a nuclear war. That's another interesting thing, is it not? In the 1960s, the one big fear we all had, regardless of our political positions, was nuclear war. We seem to have completely lost our fear of nuclear war. We've lost our fear. And it's a genuine fear. We should be frightened. We should be terrified of a nuclear war. But now we seem to think it really doesn't matter. And now, of course, as this recording is happening, there's Alaska. The President of the United States is meeting President Putin in Alaska. And it seems to me, and at the time of this recording we don't know yet, but I don't think the American delegation has absolutely any idea at all what their mission statement is. They don't know. They're turning up and hoping it'll be all right on the night. And I think that that's a very difficult situation to be in when you're dealing with a statesman like Putin, who knows exactly what he wants and knows exactly where he's going. And I feel that the presidency will be bamboozled there, and no good will come of that either. And of course, if the United States is on the back foot, that's when World War comes closer. Because you have a war because you can't, a world war is because you can't find another way out. Isn't that a dangerous thing? You can't find another alternative, so let's have a world war, which nobody can conceivably win. Do people appreciate the cost of war? I think they only really appreciate it in lives lost. And I think this is one of the problems that certainly we have in the Ukraine war, because there are no Americans coming back in body bags. So Joe Sixpack doesn't really get it. He's not really interested. The bigger economic picture, of course, he probably wouldn't understand, and he's being lied to by legacy press anyway. So that's one of the problems that you have. It's only when sons get killed. And of course, that happened with the Vietnam War. 60,000 casualties in the Vietnam War. And that became very unpopular because young American men were getting killed. America and Britain are always asleep unless people get, their sons and daughters get killed, or civilians get killed. And then people notice. But until that happens, and this is a terrible thing to admit, a terrible thing for me to say, really, unless they're getting killed or their kin are getting killed, they don't care. Anti-personnel mines were developed because if you just blow somebody's leg off, you blow a soldier's leg off, he's got to be taken back. You need all the resources for a wounded soldier to be put to get back together again. They're very heavy on resources. If you kill a soldier outright, it doesn't cost nearly as much. I know that's terribly cynical, but that's what people, that is the thinking of an anti-personnel mine. That is why they're anti-personnel men. That's why they don't blow you to smithereens, they just blow your foot off. These people, and of course the people that design that kind of thing, are at home, aren't they? They're at home, these shadowy people, and we don't know most of their names. I mean, we know Lindsey Graham, and we know the nutcases and the John Boltons of this world, or the nutcases, but there's all sorts of shadowy people that we don't know about. And they lurk in MI6 in London, they lurk in the CIA, and it's a very sad thing. And the American public will wake up one day and they will stop all this. And they'll go back, I think, perhaps it's impertinent to me to suggest this to Americans, but go back to the Monroe Doctrine, I think would probably a good idea. Yes, I'm not a pacifist because I think pacifism sends out a very bad message. So you need to be ready to fight for your country, of course you do, but what you need to do is keep out of foreign entanglements. And most treaties are dangerous. And we got into 1914, we got into a war because of the Entente Cordiale, which was only a head nod, there was no treaty. And a lot of historians don't understand this point in 1914, which incidentally cost us 3 million dead and wounded in 1914, because people claimed in the Parliament that we had a moral obligation to go to war in 1914. It was a moral obligation. That's a very dangerous game to play because that's a very subjective idea, a moral obligation. That is totally subjective. If you have a treaty, you have to stick by your treaty. But I would argue we don't need treaties. And here's a stupid thing. There is no treaty from the United States or Great Britain. There is no treaty with Israel or the Ukraine. And yet there we are, stuck in a war again, without a treaty, without any congressional or parliamentary approval. So we're throwing away our own constitutions, the Constitution in Great Britain, the Constitution and principles of law in the United States. And it goes on and nobody's brought to task because the legacy media in both countries, both Great Britain, are not investigative journalists, they're not very highly trained, and they're on the payroll. And they're there to do as they're told by whoever is paying them. And of course we know that that's probably industrial military complex or Israel. And that's where your foreign policy comes from. There is no currency which has not been degraded by war. And of course you have to degrade your currency because you can't raise enough in taxation to find that $1 trillion. So you have to degrade your currency. And the United States has degraded their currency to the most appalling extent. And it continues to this day. And I don't think it's even really begun yet. I think the decline of the dollar is really going to accelerate. And that goes also for the pound sterling as well. Your currency must be degraded by war. There is no other way you can pay for war other than taxation, which isn't big enough for modern war, or degradation of your currency. And of course it buys less. As any housewife in Great Britain or the United States will tell you, that their pound or their dollar is not going as far as it used to. Most people who don't have a basic understanding of economics, which certainly includes nearly all politicians, think that inflation is an act of God. Like the weather. Oh, it's raining today, it's raining today, or it's cold today, or it's frosty, or it's snowing. They think inflation's like that. No, inflation, what can you do? Most people think like that, which is why they go on electing the muppets that we elect. Yes, it's just another tax. It's sort of it's visible, but semi-invisible to the ordinary Joe. It's a tax. Yes, it tax. The United Kingdom Independence Party was formed in the late 1980s, and I was a very original member. I wasn't a founder member. I was a very early member. And that's because we wanted to leave the European Union and return to a parliamentary democracy and a constitutional monarchy. We believe that the laws should be made by our own people in our own democracy. It should be by our elected representatives, not by European bureaucrats. And that's the party, and it became extremely popular. And at the beginning it was a no-hope. We thought it was a no-hoper. And at the beginning, and we worked for 20 years. And of course we then had a referendum, which the government tried to cheat and lie about, but it was no good. And we voted with the biggest plebiscite ever in this country, or certainly for hundreds of years, the biggest plebiscite in this country. And we voted to leave. And now, of course, the establishment, deep state, are trying to get us back in through the back door. And that's happening now as we speak. If we actually did what we're supposed to do, which is debate things in Parliament with our elected representatives, you would be able to get a debate going, cost-benefit analysis, and also it would mean anything else should be illegal. So we've just had 3 officers captured by the Russians in the Ukraine. They are there illegally. They shouldn't be there. There's no parliamentary reason for them to be there. It's against our constitution, it's against our law. And if the Russians decide to shoot those 3 officers, I'm afraid they're perfectly entitled to do so, because they're outside any form of Geneva Convention or prisoner of war system. Smaller government is always better. Smaller government. Big government doesn't work. Smaller government, and I think the Swiss have got I think they've got it right. It's government from the bottom up, not the top down, and that's what democracy should be. And if you look at the Athenian concept of democracy, that's what it was. And you had to have what the Americans call skin in the game. So you could not be an elected politician under the Athenian system unless you were of a standard, an individual who actually contributed to society. We have a system at the moment where as soon as you're in Britain as well, if you attain the age of 18, you get a vote. Try and explain that to a man who came from Mars. A Martian comes down and said, can you explain your parliamentary system to us? How does it work? How does your democracy work? Well, as soon as you're 18, you get a vote. What, without contributing anything? No, you don't have to contribute anything. You don't have to put any money in. You don't have to be a taxpayer. You don't have to be anything at all. You just get a vote. So, of course, the majority of the population vote for freebies. They want freebies, they want free health, they want free travel, they want free... Everything's got to be free because it's not free. Nothing is free. Nothing is free. I'd ban the word free. If I could ban anything, it would be the word free. Unrestricted immigration is now part of the government plan. And this is something that people don't understand. I'm talking about Great Britain here, and I'm sure it's the same with the United States. And they're bringing in all these people, to deliberately destabilize society, which is part of the World Economic Forum plan. And then it means you can have a totally autocratic system, a non-democratic system, and you can run the country because you say, oh God, everybody's got to have ID. Everybody's got to have digital ID. Everybody's got to have their bank accounts monitored. Because, oh dear, look at this terrible crime wave we get. Look at all the rapes and stuff, and we don't know who's in the country. Well, whose fault's that? Why is our country full of people we don't know their background? They're getting 4-star hotels. They're getting 3 meals a day and preferential medical treatment over the indigenous population. No wonder they come in here in such big numbers. Nice work if you can get it. It's not an accident. First of all, we get ghettos, the parts of London now you can't go to. London's become significantly more dangerous. Crime is on the streets. Sooner or later, the indigenous population will rise up and put an end to this. But it's a shame because it doesn't have to be that way. You can round them up and send them all home. But we don't have an opposition party anywhere in this country which is actually saying they're going to do that. Trump got elected on the basis he'd round everybody up and send them back. Well, he hasn't. He's barely scraped the surface. Politicians talking a good story is one thing. You've got to see what they do. And most politicians talk a good story to get elected, and when they're elected, they don't do anything at all. Because it's very difficult, probably in deep state. How do you fight the blob? How do you fight deep state? I think the problem that we certainly have in Great Britain, and I think the problem is probably true of the United States, that people feel disenfranchised. And certainly in this country, it's reflected in the turnout. Local elections, for example, the turnout is something like 35%. And of course, the vote was reasonably good in the United States for Trump, because Trump said, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and this. One of the big things, he was going to stop war. He was going to bring the boys back. That was his big thing. None of which he's doing, or even looks like he's going to do. So consequently, everybody feels cheated in the United States, and they're going to feel more and more cheated as time goes on. They see that they voted for a bunch of lies. And it's the same in our country. People stopped voting Conservative. People stopped voting for the Conservative Party. So consequently, they got in, but they didn't increase their vote. The British government was elected with 20% of the electorate. Oh, we are certainly, I think we're at war with our own government in Great Britain, because all they do is take our money and they give money away. I mean, Zelensky, at the time of this recording, Zelensky was going into Number 10 Downing Street and he's probably going to secure another £2 or £3 billion which he can embezzle, because he's a crook. And yet there's no money to our pensions, for example, old age pensions in Great Britain. My wife is 64 yesterday. She won't get her pension now till 67. And there's now talk about her not getting it until she's 72 or 73. So all the things that people paid their taxes for and told that there would be an old age pension for have gone. And yet we have billions of pounds to give to the Ukraine for war. Billions of pounds. So there is the money there for war, but it's not there for old age pensions for British citizens who've paid in all their working lives. And people are very, very resentful when they see that going on. Why do governments and politicians not support their own people? Well, I can't speak for the United States because I don't know enough about it, but I can certainly speak for Great Britain. What does politics attract? Who do politics attract? They tend to attract, and I think it's fairly obvious the more we see of it, people who are socially dysfunctional. So people like Keir Starmer and many of his front bench are socially dysfunctional. They are preclinical sociopaths at best. And I did an interview with Professor Dutton, who's an expert in this field. Let's take Keir Starmer for a start. His mother was very seriously ill when he was 11, and he had to look after. I think the term in psychology is parentalizing. So at 11 years old, he had to take responsibility for his mother. Well, that's a complete flip up of what would be normal. Mother would normally be looking after the 11-year-old, not vice versa. So he didn't get a chance to play with other kids on the beach and so on and so forth. It's made him socially dysfunctional. And you've only got to see his attitude and his response to criticism and his overwhelming distrust or hatred of the British way of life and British systems. He hates his own country because he feels cheated out of a childhood and he's emotionally unstable. This is the truth of the matter. And of course, Boris Johnson was no better, and people were feeling, oh, Boris Johnson, oh, he's a nice, amiable, sort of buffoonish type character. No, that isn't Boris Johnson at all. Boris Johnson is another sociopath. In April 2002, he made the peace agreement that was signed in Turkey. This war in the Ukraine could have ended in 2002, April 2002. Very generous terms offered by the Russian Federation. Very generous terms indeed. And he tore it up. He went over and said, no, keep fighting. We're behind you. We'll supply with everyone. He kept them fighting. Now, that is probably 1 million casualties later. Now, today, 1 million. Now, I can bet you anything you like, Boris Johnson sleeps tight at night. He doesn't toss and turn through the night with his guilty conscience because he doesn't understand the concept of a guilty conscience, because he's a psycho. The objective of the Ukraine-Russian conflict is that's an easy one to answer. They wanted to destabilize and bring down the Russian Federation, which of course is extremely rich in minerals and oil and all sorts of other things. It's extremely rich, naturally rich country with natural resources, and of course BlackRock and all the other people who really run America wanted to get their hands on it, and they've got their fingers burnt. They've got their fingers, they're not going to get their hands on it. There was almost a medieval kind of war. It was a war to get hold of other countries' resources. An easy one to understand. The Middle East is a very much more complex idea, very much more complicated situation. This idea of a proxy war, it means that there are no Americans coming back in body bags, so they can actually destabilize, or thought they could destabilize, the Russian Federation without it costing any lives. They didn't mind it would cost money because they print dollars. It doesn't matter to the United States how much dollars they have to spend on something, because they've got a printing machine, just prints it. In fact, they create it digitally, so that's not an issue. What the Americans can't do, and Vietnam showed that in spades, is they can't have young Americans getting killed. And this was a way of destabilizing Russia on behalf of BlackRock, Vanbrugh, and all the other crooks, and Bill Gates and all the other crooks who actually now infest American politics. And so consequently they've come unstuck on that, because their war aim, let's go back to the war aim. If you talk about what was the real war aim, it was regime change. And I don't even think anybody in America tried to hide that. They didn't try to hide that. It's regime change. I mean, the coup in 2014, then putting Zelensky in a few years later, all done by MI6 and the CIA. The Ukrainian people didn't want a war with the Russian Federation. They don't want a war now, but it's run by gangsters. And the war won't end, and I'm sticking my neck out on this one a little bit, because by the time this goes out, of course, things will have moved on. But I would argue that the war will soon be over, and there will have to be a compromise. There will have to be a neutrality of Ukraine. They can't ever be members of the NATO. The Russians have made that extremely clear. We still have politicians in England saying, oh, they've got to be members of NATO eventually, blah, blah. Now, this is ridiculous. And fun enough, there is a template. There's a blueprint for all this, and that's Austria in 1945. The Soviet Union said, we will not tolerate the Austrians being members of NATO. And so it was a bit of a Mexican standoff. So we all got round the table and agreed, what about neutrality and a commitment that Austria won't join the Warsaw Pact countries and Austria won't join NATO? And the Soviet Union said, that's fine. So they've been militarily neutral since 1945, and it's worked very well. There's no reason at all that the Western Ukraine, where the Ukrainians actually mainly live, not the ethnic Russians on the other side of the east, can have a perfectly fruitful country, govern themselves, and all they've got to do is internationally commit that they won't join NATO, they won't allow foreign weaponry or missiles on their soil. This isn't difficult. And if I were Trump going to Alaska, or if I was going to Moscow in a few weeks' time, I would sit down and say, here's a deal for you. Here's the deal. Western Ukraine, west of the Dnieper River, that's going to be an independent democracy, and we'll all guarantee that won't be any weapons on it at all. And that's fine, and we can all shake hands and go home. I could fix it in a day. I could fix it in a day, which is what Trump claimed to do. He said, oh, I can fix this war in 48 hours. And he could if he said that. But I sometimes scratch my head, you know. I hesitate to say this because I'm an old man myself now, but one does wonder whether perhaps he's a tiny bit old for this kind of game, especially when he's up against a master statesman like Putin. Let's look at the wars in what is close to living memory. Not quite, but close to living memory. So it means you go back to 1914, and certainly my grandfather, we all know our grandfathers who took part in that war. If you're British, you certainly do. And what you've got to do is say, what did we get out of it? Well, we lost the British Empire, we lost the reserve currency of the world, which of course then was sterling, and it cost, as I said before, over 3 million casualties. And if you go to any English village or Scottish village, you'll find the war memorials full of names, even in rural communities, brothers, sons and fathers. The most horrific, brutal war. And where did we end up in that? We lost the empire, and we had to fight another war in 1939. On whose behalf? In 1914, we fought the war on behalf of the French. In 1939, we fought the war on behalf of the Poles. Now, I'm married into a Polish family, so I'm not sort of hostile to Poland in any way, but one has to just imagine why would we do that? What has Poland got to do with Britain? It's nasty, and Hitler was a nasty man, and it was a nasty regime, and the Nazis were really nasty. But what did we end up with? Who's the most powerful European power, or neo-European power, was the Soviet Union, which is just as evil. So where did that take us? We didn't have a treaty. There was no treaty with Poland. There was no treaty with France. I put it this way with what is sometimes referred to as World War I and World War II. One started in 1914 and one started in 1939. My grandfather, who fought in the war, badly injured on the Messines Ridge with the Royal Horse Artillery, he said, he gets very cross if you talked about World War I or World War II. He said there was only one war, boy, and it came in two parts. And I think in that one sentence, it shows you the futility of war. So we lost one generation, and then we lost hundreds of thousands in the next generation. So what did we get out of 1914? What did we get out of 1939? The answer is absolutely nothing. And if you want a bigger example, I can't think of a bigger example of a futility of war than those years. Your army is to protect your own citizens and your own land, not other people's, whether it's Israel or the Ukraine or anybody else. If you are in a democracy, you have control of your congressman. Go and see your congressman, make it very clear to him, and make absolutely sure he knows he will be out at the next election, because there's only one thing politicians love, and that's getting re-elected. The population of Western Europe, for example, doesn't want a war, or Mid or even Eastern Europe. They don't want a war. So why do our leaders want a war? There's two things. First of all, they make an argument that the situation is the same as it was in 1939 and Putin is Hitler, and if we don't stop him in the Ukraine, he'll carry on further, and he'll go further and further and further, which is geopolitically, strategically complete nonsense. I mean, that is just so wrong. Now, do they really believe that? Because that's the excuse they make. I'm not sure whether they believe it. And what we have to understand, and I don't think many people do, just how stupid politicians are. They are phenomenally stupid. So think of your local bar, think of your local pub, think of your local restaurant, think about who is the most stupid person in there, and you've got your average politician in spades. War has always been a method to try and bring the country together if the country is beginning to crumble, or it looks like it's economically or politically about to crumble. And we saw the Argentinian invasion of the Falkland Islands for that reason, with a very unpopular fascist government, and they thought it would take people's mind off it and they will come together if there was a war. I don't buy it. I think you have to have a war which is noble in spirit. I think you have to, if you're going to have a war, there has to be a real moral reason so to do, because war in its own right very often is immoral. So I think that does case. I think that people are trying to play that card, might be thinking down that route, but they don't have military experience. If I may just say something on military experience, there is no possibility that Western Europe or the European Union could field an army even remotely capable of taking on the Russian Federation. Even remotely. Because soldiers, armies, have to have two things. They have to be well-led and experience-led, and we don't have anybody. Senior officers in both the United States and Great Britain are political appointments. So you have people who are very all right with women on board ship, they're all men trans, they're all ready for this. That's the kind of army that we have. So it's not fit for purpose. And that's one side of it. The other side is as any soldier watching this, if you don't, or military historian, if you don't have combat experience, you are really behind the eight ball. Because now we have a situation with the Russian Federation, who have 1.5 million men under arms or potential arms with their reserves, with an integrated system of drones, air warfare. We wouldn't last 5 minutes against the Russian Federation. Certainly not with the sort of people that we turn out in our armies today, or from the social background that we bring people in from the armies. It need to be a disciplined society. You can't have a disciplined army without a disciplined society, and nobody in Europe has that. Nobody wants to be a soldier. Who would want to be a soldier to go up against the Russian Federation? Most young men don't think there's any reason to do so, and they're right. I looked at the United States recruitment, and it's the same with British recruitment adverts. You know, I get time off with my baby. You know, I get most weekends off. You know, this is the kind of thing that you get recruiting. Oh, you know, you get a pay and I get a very good pension, you know, if I do my 10 years or my 15 years or whatever it is. And you get all this and I'm a good, and all this kind of thing. I still get time to go to ballet classes and all that kind of shit. So now have a look at a Chinese recruit or Russian recruitment advert. And you've got a really grizzly bugger here with a half-eaten baby in one hand and a Kalashnikov in the other hand, and he goes, yeah, I'm here to kill people on behalf of Russia. You know, and you go, whoa. They're the kind of people they're recruiting. We're recruiting Nancy boys and pansies. They don't make soldiers. You know, you have to be tough and you have to be hard. The United States has still got a few. I think the United States Marine Corps is still probably fit for combat, and I think some of our better regiments are, you know, the Brigade of Guards and things like that, and maybe one or two good county regiments. But generally speaking, we couldn't go to war even if we wanted to, and who would we field? We couldn't field more than probably 500,000 men to start with, and they've got 1.5 million. I think we need a new deal for our military, and I think we need to go back to defence. Mm-hmm. It's the Ministry of Defence in this country. You know, we talk about defence spending. We don't ever talk about attack spending. We don't talk about the Ministry for Attack. We talk about defence. Yeah. And we don't need much for defence. It means somebody's got to get on a boat and come and invade us when all they've got to do is get in a paddle boat and row across, haven't they? Yeah. And be met at Dover and put in a hotel. But if we wanted to defend our island, we need a good navy and a good air force and all the rest of it. And of course, we do have a reserve nuclear dependent. We have the nuclear button should we need it as a deterrent thing. So we don't need a big army. We don't really need a big air force. We don't need. Who wants to attack us? There's got to be a foeman. Now, NATO in the old days, when I was a member of NATO, the Soviet Union was a potentially hostile power. It was a military power. It was potentially hostile, and it wasn't a very nice regime. They went years ago. They've gone. It's the Russian Federation now, and the Russian Federation just wants to trade. They don't want to take over anybody. They certainly don't want to take over the Western Ukraine, which is a nation of psychos. So they don't want that. They want Ukraine to be happy. They want Ukraine to be prosperous and trade. It's all about trade. Let's trade. But no, I think we need a reappraisal of what it's for. What is our? Go back to the United States Constitution. Tells you all you need to know, really, isn't it? That you don't need all these ships and guns and all the rest of it. And of course, then you look at some of the fine-tune the spending. Look at the aircraft carrier groups, for example, in the Red Sea. So you've got billions and billions and billions of dollars with F-35s on them and all the rest of it. And you've got these huge aircraft carriers. You know, you've got Nimitz, you've got all these other great carriers and battle groups. They've had to go south off the Yemeni coast. They've had to go south because the Houthis can blow them up with something they ordered on Amazon yesterday, which cost $10,000. What kind of world are we living in? They've got all this kit, and I said this at the time. We've got 2 aircraft carriers, and I said I wrote an article for a magazine about 7 years ago when we launched them. The aircraft carriers have been out of date. They've been obsolete since Okinawa. They're just great big fat targets, and they're no use at all, and they suck in billions of dollars. NATO had a great role to play. I was a member of it and I believed in it. It's long since past its sell-by date, and we did promise, head of NATO, again the United States, promised faithfully that NATO would not expand, and it's expanded, and one look at a map can show that. It's right through the Baltic, up through Poland, Romania, and Belarus. It has expanded, and in the same way, that's a danger to all those countries who are members of NATO. And it's the same way that the greater Israel is a threat in the Middle East. This is about Western-backed expansionism. And if you look at the idea of a greater Israel, sooner or later that's going to blow up because, again, the Egyptian government and the Jordanian government aren't doing anything about it. They're sort of going along with it all. But their people are getting very fed up. And there you are going to see a coup. We live in very dangerous times, which would not be so dangerous if we reinvented diplomacy. We need to reinvent diplomacy, and at the moment there is no diplomacy. Every war that the United States has fought since the Korean War has been an exercise in sheer futility. I'm not sure. They've all been destabilizing wars. And you look at the Horn of Africa, you look at Libya, you look at Iraq, and you look at these places, they leave a mess. And I would argue, and I would say this, wouldn't I, as a Brit, I would argue that when we expanded our empire, it was for the common good. You find that the sanitation worked, railway systems worked, countries were mapped. All the Indian subcontinent was British, founded their railway systems, everything. We brought something to a country when we made it a colony. Americans bring nothing but devastation. There's only devastation. Everywhere they go and then leave, and I've lost count of the numbers of times that they've done it, they just leave a trail of debris behind them. But you see, it doesn't matter. It just means more orders for the industrial military complex, which runs the show. More weapons, more. We blew up all those missiles, we've done all this, we've done all that, we need another lot. And so it goes on, and so it goes on.